Good day, dangerous Doom Slayers! I'm
Unsilent, and this is Doom.
Given that it's one of the most popular and influential games of all time, it's no surprise that Doom has been ported to 15 consoles over the last 26 years. Some of those have been very fondly regarded, including the PlayStation and even the Game Boy Advance versions of the game, while others have been panned by critics and gamers alike, and not just because of needless DRM slapped on top of the game. Some ports of Doom were doomed from the start, pun intended, and resulted in versions of the game that aren't just bad ports, but bad games in general. Take this game, Doom on the 3DO, for example. Let's take a look at this version of the game as I ask, what the port? Hello, and welcome to What the Port, a new series in which I look at the weird, wacky, and woeful of video game ports. In this first episode, I take a look at one of the most ported games of all time, Doom, with 15 official ports of the original game being released over the last quarter century, from 1994's Sega 32X version to this year's console and mobile releases. It's believed to be the third most ported game of all time behind Tetris and Street Fighter II. Given the relatively limited power of consoles back in the 90s, not every one of those versions of Doom could be as good as the PC original. The 3DO version is the fifth port of Doom released after the PC launch, following the Sega 32X, the Atari Jaguar, or Jaguar if you're over in Britain, Super Nintendo, and PlayStation 1. Why do I mention all of those? Well, the Atari version was developed by it themselves and is the version upon which the 3DO version is based. Not surprisingly, it made sure to make what is considered a damn good port to the Jag. The PS1 version is considered the best Doom port to date, while the 32X and SNES versions were at the low end of the spectrum. The first two ports for the Atari and the SNES were dropped in 1994, while the latter two were released for the holiday shopping season in 1995. 3DO Doom was also supposed to release then, but missed the mark and landed in 1996. The development of 3DO Doom is both funny and sad. Funny given 2 decades of hindsight and the story of what happened, but sad when you play the result. The problem with the 3DO port of Doom was the publisher who purchased the rights to port Doom to the 3DO. Art Data Interactive was a company that ended up with a total of 3 titles under its belt by the time the company ended. One of them was the 3DO port of Doom, and the other 2 you've probably never heard of, which might also explain how we ended up with 3DO Doom. Art Data Interactive CEO Randy Scott had grand plans for 3DO Doom to make it the best version of Doom, perhaps better than the PC original. This new version of Doom was to include new maps, new weapons, new enemies, and even FMV story elements, as was the style at the time. However, Scott seemingly had no understanding of how to make a port of a game, or a game period. When he hired a developer for the project, Rebecca Heineman, aka Burger Becky, Scott told her that the project was mostly done, but a little polish was required. What she got was a retail copy of Doom 1 and some JPEGs, which Scott believed was enough to make a game. So Heineman didn't even have a copy of the source code, but she was supposed to have the game ready for release in 10 weeks. Now, Heineman isn't some random programmer. In the 90s, she was a heavyweight in gaming. She was one of the founders of Interplay, and was one of the company's lead programmers. She wasn't a stranger to the 3DO either, having worked on the well-regarded 3DO port of Wolfenstein 3D. However, a miracle worker, Heineman was not. In order to make the port as quickly as possible, Heineman found whatever shortcut was reasonable to make a 3DO Doom happen. That included acquiring the source code to Atari Jaguar Doom from id Software and using that as a basis for the 3DO port. Coincidentally, that air quotes shortcut was quite common, as the Sega 32X, PlayStation, and Game Boy Advance ports were all based on id's Jaguar port. I guess if you're going to borrow someone's homework, it may as well be the top pupil in the class. The result was a game that was a long way from what Scott had promised to the press for his version of Doom. Of the 4 promised new additions of new maps, weapons, enemies, and story, it was the full-motion video scenes that came closest to fruition. While actual scenes weren't filmed, some stills were taken of costumes and actors to draw up investment into the project that could have led to those scenes being filmed. While I'll admit that Gaming putting a greater emphasis on story and putting stories in games rather than the manuals is something I have been a massive fan of. I don't really think that Doom needed a hammy love story and sub-B movie acting to improve it. I mean, it would have been a laugh. I mean, I loved that in The Seventh Guest, but that was its own thing and not someone tacking a fan film onto a beloved classic. So, Doom fans? I think they would have bought every copy of the game just to send it to hell. So with the history out of the way, how is 3DO Doom? Well, through the power of emulators, the best I could say is, oh boy. Sure, emulators can improve how a game performs, but RetroArch's 3DO emulator seems pretty accurate to how the game plays on consoles based on what I've read and seen of 3DO Doom. Now let's start with the gameplay. As you saw at the start of the video, speed is not one of this port's strengths. When the action gets busy, or the game has to render large spaces, or door opens or closes, or you move, the frame rate has a tendency to drop. And depending on the size of the screen, it can drop into the single digits frames per second. But Digital Foundry's testing showed that even at the smallest screen size, the frame rate doesn't crack 20 FPS. Wait, did I say screen size? Why, yes, I did. You see, on the cover of the game, it says, "Features full screen display for use with any 3DO system." And that's true from a certain point of view. The UI does take up the screen, the actual gameplay doesn't. There are 6 different screen sizes, with the 2 largest being locked behind a cheat code. It doesn't run terribly at the smallest size, but good luck seeing anything. The default largest size does have some noticeable frame drops. The actual largest may as well be a slideshow. And it's not like the 3DO was an underpowered console. In fact, it had the same amount of RAM and video RAM as the PlayStation 1, which released 1 year after the 3DO. The only real power deficit it had was in the CPU department. Both the 3DO and the PS1 had a 32-bit processor, but the 3DOs only ran at 12.5 MHz, while the PS1 ran at 33.9 MHz. So why does the game have screen sizes that it can't really run, you might ask? Because the 3DO company was working on a successor console, the M2, which would have been powerful enough to run the game smoothly. In fact, the game was programmed in such a way that the 2 largest screen sizes wouldn't be locked behind a cheat code, but unlocked if the game was played on the M2. Of course, the M2 was cancelled before it was ever released, so we'll never know how well it would run Doom, but it certainly couldn't have been worse than this. So not only does the game run at very variable speeds, but that also makes navigating very difficult. As the frame rate speeds up, so does your movement, so Doom Guy has a tendency to run into walls. Squeezing into tight spaces can take a few tries. It's also surprisingly easy to get yourself surrounded. Basically, the slow and variable frame rate has a few knock-on effects, including unresponsive controls, which combined with Doom Guy's accelerating movement makes the game more difficult than it was supposed to be. Because the game is based off of id's original Jaguar port, not only does 3DO Doom not have any new enemies, but it's missing the Cyber Demon and the Spider Mastermind. The game is also short some levels compared to the PC version. 3DO Doom has 24 levels rather than 27 in the PC original Doom, as the Jaguar version was developed and released before the release of the Ultimate Doom and Episode 4 Thy Flesh Consumed, so that's 9 levels missing right there. Of the 24 levels in this game, there are a few that have been modified from their original to leave out whole sections or features such as crushing ceilings, which aren't in this port of the game. 2 levels keep the same name as original levels, but are actually completely new levels. Also, because the game doesn't have episode breaks, but is just one long set of 23 maps, and it has the E1M9 bonus level as the sole bonus level, coded as level 24 in this. The difficulty is a little skewed because you can just carry over weapons through all the levels as opposed to the reset at E2M1 and E3M1. I've put a quick map comparison on the screen for you, but I'll give you a couple notes while it's there. First, while Tower of Babel and Hellkeep were the names of maps in PC Doom, those maps on the 3DO were not ported from the PC. E2M9 was renamed from Fortress of Mystery to Dis, as in DIS, not me trying to be funny. And it was used as the final level of the game rather than as the bonus map for Episode 2, which quite confused me because I was looking for the bonus level and there was no way to access it. The reason for renaming is likely because the final map of Doom, E3M8, was called Dis. If you'll recall, that one ends with the Spider Mastermind fight, but since that enemy's not in the game, 4 Barons of Hell and 8 Caco Demons are your substitute final boss. And since E3M1 was missing from console Dooms, that meant that the E3M9 bonus map was also missing, as it's based on E3M1. But it's not all negatives for this port. Spectres are in the game. At this point, it was only the second of 5 ports to include the translucent monster. Considering that the aforementioned Atari Jaguar port didn't include Spectres, it makes this something of an accomplishment. The game also has a new take on the soundtrack, which is often considered to be the biggest or sometimes sole highlight of this port. While Randy Scott may not have been a great game development executive, he was a pretty good musician. One shortcut that Heinemann made while porting Doom was getting Scott to do a new soundtrack for the game with his band, rather than spending time making a driver to play the original MIDI music files, and to take advantage of the 3DO's CD player. The result, as you heard throughout this video, is a fresh but largely faithful reimagining of the Doom soundtrack. And it never bogs down on playback regardless of how few frames of video are playing. And if I'm being honest, even if a bunch of the original levels have been modified or deleted and changes to textures have been made to be console friendly, at least it still looks like Doom. Some other ports had questionable graphics or were lacking side and back sprites of monsters, so this game looking like Doom isn't a non-accomplishment. And the game had circle strafing, which was also an accomplishment on consoles at the time. But let's really be honest here. Doom looks cool and sounds great, but the gameplay is what makes Doom Doom, and that's where this game falls apart. If the game ran at a steady frame rate in the double digits, and I'm not even saying get it to 36 FPS like the original, it would make all the difference in the world. When it runs smoothly, it's still Doom, and Doom is still a hell of a lot of fun. Even if the screen is so small you can't actually see any of the enemies, it's still fun. The problem is that Doom, at slideshow speeds, is the farthest from fun. Under the circumstances of having to get a game to playable in 10 weeks, it's an accomplishment. However, nobody really cares how the sausage is made. Now, it's a fun story for the history books, yes, but it doesn't fix all the problems with the game. And after playing through 3DO Doom a couple of times and replaying the PC original, it's easy to call 3DO Doom a bad port. It's also easy to call it terrible, awful, dire, hopeless, and utterly horrifying. But the soundtrack is good, so it has something going for it. Which is nice. And whatever happened to Art Data Interactive and Randy Scott? Well, various sources said that Scott had 50,000 copies of Doom printed. Heinemann said that even the 3DO company themselves tried to talk him out of printing that many copies, but they were still willing to take his money. At the time, the 3DO had a user base of about 250,000 consoles in the wild. Reportedly, only 10,000 of those 50,000 copies were sold. Not surprisingly, Art Data Interactive went out of business shortly thereafter, and Randy Scott hasn't been around the gaming industry since. And that's my look at the port of Doom for the 3DO. Were you one of the lucky, or is it unlucky, few to play this game? Leave some of your memories in the comments down below. And while you're on your way to the comments, hit that like button if you liked the video, subscribe if you're new or looking for more videos about classic and not so classic retro games, share on social media, follow on social media. My social media handle is Unsilent on Air for Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Tumblr, and don't forget there are plenty more in-depth looks at retro games. We've got playlists on the screen, in the description down below, and more videos anytime on the channel page. And until the next time, I'm Unsilent. Thanks very much for joining me. Like, share, subscribe, and we will see you next time.